I want this all day.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in Captain America: First Avenger. Guys, we are diving deep into this breakdown, giving you behind-the-scenes details and all the little things that the MCU would call back to years later. And most importantly, we're going to talk about how this movie sets up a 7-film character arc for Steve Rogers. And I am so excited to show you guys these brand new Cap parody merch designs that we have at our merch store. There's the America's Ass commemorative stamp, the Ross 24 shirt, and the 8-bit RPG where Cap is presented with the choice: ask if anyone wants to get out or hail Hydra. These are available as t-shirts or hoodies for cold weather, and we love designing all of our Marvel parody shirts for you guys, and you can find these and other designs on our merch shelf below. Also, if you want to become a member so you don't miss out on any new merch announcements, the link for that is below as well. Now, first of all, you have to appreciate just how risky this movie was when it was made. They were setting a superhero movie 70 years in the past, and Captain America was not even considered to be a bankable property at the time. He was adapted in a movie serial in the 1940s, 2 1970s TV movies, and an atrocious 1990s straight-to-video movie. But Marvel Studios saw that this is a great character who has been reinvented by countless creators over the years. He was originally created in 1941 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Now look, accounts on his creation vary, with Jack saying that he drew the hero first, and Simon saying that they wanted to come up with a hero who was powerful enough to defeat the ultimate villain, Hitler.
Get yourself a good villain, and then get a foil for the villain. Adolf Hitler was there, so I figured, well, he's a live one on his own brutal way. He'll be the villain, and get yourself a patriotic guy to be his foil.
Now, Kirby passed away in 1994, but Simon actually lived long enough to see the first Avenger in theaters. But guys, you also have to remember that in 1941, the USA was not even at war with Germany, and depicting a hero socking Hitler in the jaw was considered controversial. Kirby told a story about 3 thugs who were in the lobby who wanted to show Kirby what a real Nazi would do to Captain America.
I once had 6 Nazis call me up and they said, well, we're waiting for you downstairs. We're going to beat the daylights out of you, you know, for writing these stories about Hitler. And so I said, hold on, guys, I'll be right down. And of course I take the elevator down, and but there was nobody there. I looked in the street, and of course they wouldn't be there. And you know, if they wanted to fight, well, what the heck?
And that's the thing. Simon and Kirby instilled that kind of courage in Steve, which bleeds through into this film, where his main motivation to fight is...
I don't like bullies.
So the film was directed by the great Joe Johnston, who is a visual effects designer on the original Star Wars trilogy and Raiders of the Lost Ark. He also directed the highly underrated film The Rocketeer. So The Rocketeer is, I think, largely why Marvel tapped him for this movie. It's an adventure set in World War II about a hero who uses a jetpack to fight Nazis. Now, the jetpack was given to him by Howard Hughes, who was the model for young Howard Stark in this movie. So it's appropriate that Howard gives Steve his shield, just like Howard Hughes gave the Rocketeer his jetpack. So the movie opens in the Arctic with Steve being frozen in ice. Now, I actually think this is one of the movie's biggest mistakes, but I'll talk about that later in the video. Now, you guys probably know that Steve was originally going to enter the MCU in The Incredible Hulk. There is a deleted scene where Banner attempts suicide, and the resulting avalanche was going to free Captain America from the ice.
Yeah, this is much better.
Yes, it is, but this movie does name another monster that's responsible for Cap's release: climate change.
This landscape's changing all the time.
Now, believe it or not, this entire scene was filmed on a smoked up soundstage with a green screen, but the sun behind them is actually a light that is on tracks so they can create the illusion of movement. They also say,
I don't know, it's probably a weather balloon.
Because after people claimed an alien ship crash landed in Roswell in the 1950s, the government said that it was merely a weather balloon. But this remark actually isn't far off, because this crash was associated with an alien object, the Tesseract. Now, when they cut a hole in the ship's roof, a shaft of light shines down, one of the movie's many homages to Raiders of the Lost Ark when Indy discovers the Well of Souls. Now, this whole sequence was shot on the same set as the final fight. In fact, they actually had to pause filming the climax so they could dress up the set to look frozen, and then they had to unfreeze it for the final shots they needed. This was one of 115 sets designed for the film, almost one per page of the screenplay. Now, after that brief tease, we go to Tonsberg, which we first saw here in the year 500 in Thor, and then again as the setting for New Asgard in Avengers Endgame Endgame and Thor Love and Thunder. Now, the original opening scene here would have actually shown a giant Hydra tank rolling through the town, chasing this man who was trying to warn the caretaker of their approach. Also, notice the code name of the movie was Frostbite, which is also the name of the Blu-ray when you pop it into your computer. And then we see Schmidt's car, which was frankly an engineering marvel created for this film. Notice the headlights on the car are slits, like the eyes of a Hydra mask. But this was also a common practice during the war. People taped up their headlights so they were harder to spot by enemy planes at night. Now, this car has 6 wheels, in case Schmidt needed to go off-roading. But like a lot of the vehicles in this movie we'll talk about later, this was actually based on a real design of the Mercedes G4. The car is 28 feet long with a turning radius of almost 40 feet. So it took a 700 horsepower engine just to move the damn thing. Hugo Weaving based his German accent partially on the great director Werner Herzog.
I would like to see the baby.
And notice that we can see just a little bit of pucker here in his neck that shows the skin mask that he's wearing to cover his red skull. So in the comics, the Red Skull first appeared in Cap's very first issue, and he quickly became a model for like every supervillain going forward. He is a true believer in Hitler's twisted views of racial purity, while his greatest enemy is also a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Superman. This is one of the many common themes between Steve and the Skull that we'll talk about a little later in the video. Traditionally, the Skull is usually chasing the Cosmic Cube, a wish-granting MacGuffin that the MCU reimagined as the Tesseract. So here, I want to take a minute to do a really nerdy deep dive into Schmidt's obsession with Norse mythology. In issue 2 of the prequel comic, Captain America First Vengeance, Schmidt attends a Wagner opera about the quest for the Holy Grail where he meets Hitler, and then he convinces Hitler's right-hand man Himmler that there are ancient valuables in the world that have mystical power. And this is how he gets the approval to go looking for the Tesseract. But all of this connects to another Wagner opera, his masterpiece, The Valkyries. Now, you probably know that opera best from this. Now, of course, we do see actual Valkyries in the MCU, but in Norse mythology, they are goddesses who determine who is actually worthy to enter Valhalla. This is why his ship at the end of the movie is called the Valkyrie. It's there to destroy every major city in the world, to effectively choose who is worthy to enter Schmidt's new paradise. Now, Schmidt listens to this opera twice throughout the movie. But the opera, The Valkyries, is also a kind of origin story for a hero called Siegfried, who in Norse mythology was called Sigurd. Sigurd, or Siegfried, is a story about a hero who kills a dragon and is guided by a bird of the forest. And get this, Sigurd appears in this movie. So this photo is a real wooden carving in a church that's in Hilstad, Norway, depicting Sigurd and the smith Regan forging a sword to slay the dragon. And then they Photoshop the Tesseract in between them. And in the Schmidt montage, we see an image of Sigurd listening to the forest bird who tells him to seek the Valkyrie Brunhilde. Just like how Schmidt's goal in this movie is to seek and create his own Valkyrie, the ship we see at the end of the film. So when he appears in the church, the hole in the wall is shaped like a skull with 2 shafts of light for eyes. Nice foreshadowing for his real supervillain identity. And he says,
And the Führer digs for trinkets of the desert.
Another nod to Hitler looking for the Ark of the Covenant and Raiders of the Lost Ark. So Schmidt displays his powers here in the first scene when he easily moves this crypt lid away after these men struggle to budget before him. Then he smashes a fake Tesseract, just like how Thanos, another villain searching for godhood who is worshipped by his followers, smashes the real Tesseract in Infinity War. Now, Odin hid the Tesseract on Earth, likely after using it to invent the Bifrost technology that allows Asgardians, and only Asgardians, to teleport across the 9 realms. What makes you say that? Well, after the Tesseract was returned to Earth in the Avengers, suddenly the Bifrost was repaired in time for Thor: The Dark World. But the real cube is hidden behind a fiberglass carving of Yggdrasil, the world tree from Norse mythology that guards all life. And of course, this tree now does exist in the MCU as the multiversal tree where Loki now protects all life as the god of stories. And the Tesseract is hidden within the eye of the Midgard serpent. Now, in Norse mythology, this serpent encircles the Earth. So it's fitting that it's also hiding the Tesseract, since the actual Tesseract is also hidden on Earth. After Schmidt shoots Filch, a good bit of CGI blood splashes on his Hydra pen, foreshadowing that he is actually the Red Skull. And then we go to some of the most underrated, under-talked about visual effects in the MCU, skinny Steve Rogers. Now, they had considered doing something similar to Tom Hanks in Castaway, where they actually took 6 months off so Hanks could lose a bunch of weight. But there was no room for that in the MCU's production schedule, which meant that they had to rely on camera tricks and digital technology. So let's break down how they pulled this off to look so convincing. So on set, set, they shot everything 3 different ways. Once with a body double who copied Chris Evans' movements, usually to help the other actors with their eye lines, and then they would shoot the environment clean for a visual effects plate. But most importantly, they shot muscly Chris Evans wearing very baggy clothes. So the effects were done at Lola, who 5 years earlier pioneered de-aging technology for X-Men The Last Stand. Then the Lola team would shrink down Chris Evans digitally. They made him shorter, thinned his body, thinned his face, while always leaving his face the same size so we wouldn't lose Chris Evans' performance. And guys, there is never a moment in this movie where I do not 100% buy this transformation. Just keep in mind that most of the time when actors are looking at skinny Steve, they're actually staring at Chris Evans' belly button. Now, when Steve is trying to sign up, all of the newspapers let us know how bad the war is going for the Allies. U-boats off the Virginia coast, Nazis retake Zhytomyr. But here, on the right, upside down, the headline reads, "Elite Nazi forces overwhelm Norwegian town," which is talking about the opening we just saw in Tonsberg. On his enlistment form, we see, of course, that Steve was born on July 4th, just like in the comics, but in the year 1918. Now, this was the last year of World War I, and the only year when the U.S. made a meaningful impact. So the timeline does line up that his dad died of mustard gas probably before Steve was ever born. He also says that his mom was a nurse who contracted tuberculosis, which we do see in issue 1 of the prequel comic, Captain America: First Vengeance. And then we go to one of the 3 scenes where Steve is in a movie theater. Now, at first, he is a spectator watching the real war, and then he is a spectator watching a fake war, and finally, he is on screen actually getting to fight the war. So this scene is lifted from the excellent reimagining of his origin story, The Adventures of Captain America: Sentinel of Liberty, issue 1, where a pre-serum Steve Rogers begins the comic by watching a newsreel. It's also important that the newsreel focuses on how children can help the war effort from home.
Even little Timmy is doing his part, collecting scrap metal. Nice work, Timmy.
Now, for Steve's entire life, he's been smaller than everybody else. He's been looked down upon and bullied. He's been treated like a child. So when he sees this, it hits home that this is exactly what Steve does not want to have happen, like he says later.
What do you want me to do? Collect scrap metal in my little red wagon?
Why not?
I'm not going to sit in the factory, Bucky.
This establishes Steve's main desire in the MCU. He wants to join others, to be a part of something greater than himself. He carries this desire through the Avengers when he signs up for Fury's new team. Then he joins S.H.I.E.L.D. and he chooses to stay with the team after Thor and Tony leave at the end of Age of Ultron.
Avengers!
But also, these kinds of scrap drives were real, and they resulted in a lot of moms throwing out their kids' comic books to be recycled. So one of the reasons Captain America issue 1 is worth so much money and it's so rare is because of the war that was actually depicted inside of those pages. In the alley, Steve stands up to the first of many bullies he'll face over the years, uttering his catchphrase,
I want this all day.
and the trash can shield is the first model of his eventual vibranium shield, even complete with the many circles around the center. And then Bucky shows up to save him. Now, in the original comics, Bucky was always Steve's teenage sidekick. When Steve was unfrozen in the 1960s, back in Avengers number 4, it was revealed that Bucky was killed in the final days of World War II. That is, until years later, when Ed Brubaker resurrected him as the Winter Soldier. Brubaker also retconned Bucky's story a bit, making him a special ops force who loved doing the dirty work, which served as the inspiration for his character in this movie. So, in this scene, Sebastian Stan had to stand on apple boxes to make himself taller, one of many camera tricks they used to pull off the skinny Steve illusion. And when Steve asks where they're going, he replies,
Future.
which, as it turns out, is very true.
She's gotta be 100 years old right now. So are we, pal.
And man, is this World's Fair Expo filled with Easter eggs. Some are obvious, but others I bet you never noticed. Now, in the real world, the World's Fairs were massive exhibitions of science and technology that were built to showcase what new industries had to offer. So there have actually been 2 World's Fairs at Flushing Meadows where this takes place. Now, that iconic globe that we see in the opening shot was actually built in the 1960s. However, the previous World's Fair was held in 1940, so the timeline kind of matches up. Now, in the MCU, Howard Stark turns this fair into the annual Stark Expo, which his son Tony would start to recreate starting in Iron Man 2. This scene takes place in the modern Marvel's Pavilion, which of course is a nod to Marvel Comics. This entire environment was CG, with Sebastian Stan and Chris Evans walking on a treadmill on a green screen soundstage, so the artist could create this Art Deco, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers inspired design just behind them. Now, I'm sure a lot of you eagle-eyed gunters have spotted this red mannequin in a tube with the name Phineas Horton. In the comics, Horton was the creator of the original original Human Torch, who was an android. Now, this is not just a nod to Chris Evans playing a different Human Torch in the Fantastic Four. The android Human Torch fought alongside Captain America in World War II alongside Namor. Now, Namor is not in this scene, but there is an aquatic pavilion where we can make out the word tomorrow. So maybe this exhibit was about people building cities under the ocean in the future. See, the Human Torch and Namor both appeared in the very first Marvel comic, Marvel Comics #1, which eventually would be the comic they would take their name from. So on the left here, we also see something called Tele-O-Vision. Now, showcasing that television was in its early stages does explain how Hydra has security cameras years before they were actually invented. For the Americans, this was cutting-edge technology, but Hydra is just a few years ahead of us. We also see an exhibit for Earth's treasure with oil derricks in a cross-section of the Earth, which does not include a god baby growing inside of it because, you know, people have no idea there's actually a celestial growing inside the Earth's core.
But what? I can't believe.
But of course, the main attraction is Howard Stark and his flying car. He has surrounded himself by dancers who are dressed kind of like him, just like Tony will do years later at his Stark Expo. And we also see that he's a womanizer like his son. So the car is using something called Stark reversion technology, which doesn't work.
I did say a few years, didn't I?
But this actually does help to set up Iron Man 2, when Howard Stark tells Tony to finish what he started.
I'm limited by the technology of my time, but one day you'll figure this out.
And remember, Howard designed this entire Stark Expo to be a map of a new element, so Tony could one day complete his work for him. Remember, this is also how Iron Man 1 starts. Howard Stark built a giant arc reactor, but it takes Tony's knowledge and expertise to shrink it down into something that can fit inside of his chest.
That's because it's a miniaturized arc reactor. I got a big one powering my factory at home.
But I also think this movie provides evidence that we actually have Arnim Zola to thank for Iron Man, but I'll go into that theory a little bit later. Now, years later, the flying car would be perfected in the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for Phil Coulson's car Lola. And big shout out to the channel Heavy Spoilers for pointing out that the color of Tony's Iron Man suit was inspired by his own hot rod. So we're seeing a family tradition of cars inspiring the boys to create new technology. Also, I read this on IMDb. This rocket is from the great Belgian comic book Tintin, Destination Moon by Herge. And also throughout the pavilion and recruitment office, we do see real-life World War II recruitment posters. There is, of course, Uncle Sam, this one that says, "Let's go Marines and man the guns for the Navy." And of course, when he and Bucky finally part, their exchange is repeated decades later in Avengers Endgame.
Don't do anything stupid until I get back.
How can I? Taking all the stupid with you.
When Steve steps into the recruitment office, there's a mirror where people can see themselves as a soldier. Now, Steve is too small to see himself, and actually, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse used a similar shot in the 2018 film. But this is also foreshadowing the super soldier chamber later on, where Steve's eyes are at first below the window, but after the procedure, he fits into the chamber perfectly. Also, look, they're offering free coffee and donuts just to the right here of the frame. And imagine going into this office and saying, you know, I'm not sure if I want to go to war, but will there be sweets? When he meets Erskine, they have this exchange where they tell each other where they're from.
Where are you from?
Queens.
And I wonder if this might have been on Steve's mind years later when he met Spider-Man.
You got hard, kid. Where you from?
Queens?
Brooklyn.
Like maybe he sees the same kind of courage in Peter that Erskine saw in him. And when Steve is finally recruited, notice the list of ailments on the wall is looming over him, telling us that these are the obstacles that he is going to have to overcome. And then we cut to Zola's experiments with the Tesseract. So this scene begins with his face magnified in glass, which is both an Easter egg to his comic book appearance in his android body, but also foreshadows how his consciousness will be duplicated as an AI in the Winter Soldier. And here we see that even with limited technology, Zola is easily able to harness the power of the cube. And this brings me to my Tony Stark theory. See, we learned in the Winter Soldier that Zola was recruited to work for S.H.I.E.L.D., and we know that he worked in the same facility as the Tesseract because Howard Stark is looking for him in Endgame.
Looking for Dr. Zola. Have you seen him?
So why didn't Zola harness the cube's energy for S.H.I.E.L.D.? Well, I think he did. I think Howard and Peggy said, hey, don't use the cube to make weapons. We want it to make energy. So he helped Howard to build the first arc reactor using the cube's energy, which Tony was later able to replicate because he knew the chemical reactions that powered the arc reactor. I don't know, it seems like a stretch. Well,
As stated, it is only a theory.
when they're powering up the device, Zola stops at 70%, which is the same percentage that Steve's procedure stops on later in the movie. This is one of many parallels between Steve and the Red Skull we'll talk about later on.
Same, but different.
Also, and this is a small thing, but I think it's funny that the Red Skull has a Hydra-themed folder holder on his desk. Oh, and also, notice this drawing depicts somebody with a squid head. Now, I found a lot of online speculation that this could be the Inhuman Hive. The show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. retconned Hydra's origin to say they had existed for hundreds of years and were created to bring this Inhuman to Earth and mind control the planet. And then we go to Camp Lehigh for Steve's training. And this camp also first appeared in Captain America Comics issue 1. And of course, we meet the love of his life, Peggy Carter.
Because I got a few moves I know you'll like.
Now, she was first created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee back in Tales of Suspense number 75 in 1966, but she was only added as a family member to Cap's love interest, her niece Sharon Carter. However, she is also very similar to Agent 13, a character from Cap's first appearance that accompanied him on missions during his original run. Cameron Hodge first appeared in The Adventures of Captain America Sentinel of Liberty number 1, and notice how after she tells him,
"Put your right foot forward,"
Steve grins a little bit because he knows a thing or two about how to take a punch. If one foot is in front of the other, your balance is better and you're less likely to fall down. So Carter was actually giving Hodge every advantage to stay standing, and she still knocked him to the dirt. And then Tommy Lee Jones appears as Colonel Phillips, and I love this little pause he gives right before his speech.
General Patton.
It's just like a fun acting choice from this Academy Award winner. He quotes General Patton,
"Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won by men."
Now, George S. Patton was a general in World War II who was brilliant and drove the Third Army across France at breakneck speed. He was also very controversial, and he was reprimanded for slapping a shell-shocked soldier. But like Steve Rogers, he was also not able to enjoy winning the war because he died from a car accident in December 1945. Now, the Camp Lehigh training scenes were shot in a backlot at Pinewood Studios, which was the same location where they filmed this car chase in the movie Goldfinger. When Steve unpacks his footlocker, we see a copy of Heroes of the Western Front, which is a real book about Sergeant Alvin York. York was a war hero who served in World War I. He led an attack on a machine gun nest, killed 25 enemies, and took 132 prisoners. Now, York's story is actually similar to Steve's in this film. Steve single-handedly leads the rescue of 200 men and is awarded the Medal of Honor. During his training, we see Hodge bully him by dropping this barbed wire post on his head. Now, I think this is interesting because years later, Steve will still associate barbed wire with bullies and people who are not willing to sacrifice themselves for others, like he tells Tony.
You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play, to lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
Also notice that the flag for Camp Lehigh shows a star surrounded by 2 laurel leaves, which might have been one of the eventual inspirations for Steve's design of his shield. And I love this scene where he outsmarts everyone to get the flag. So a couple of things to notice here. 1, he disobeys his sergeant's orders.
Rogers! I said fall in!
Just like decades later, he demonstrates that he always knows when not to obey his superiors. But also, if this were an American flag, he'd be in trouble because you're not allowed to let the flag touch the ground. But since it's the base flag, he gets a pass. And then we get to the scene where Steve Rogers shows us who he is. And while they're doing push-ups, and by the way, remember, this is buff Chris Evans pretending to have a hard time doing push-ups, Colonel Phillips throws a grenade on the ground. Now, he knows the grenade is safe because it's taken from a crate marked training grenades. Now, the Channel Canadian lad pointed out that not only does Steve jump on the grenade, but Peggy Carter also goes to jump toward the grenade herself, showing that she is also worthy to receive the serum like we saw in What If Episode 1. When Erskine has his late night talk with Steve, he explains Schmidt's backstory.
He and Hitler share a passion for occult power and Teutonic myth.
Now, when the filmmakers created this montage, they were trying to imitate German Expressionism, the film style prominent in the 1920s that emphasized feeling over reality, with the use of exaggerated angles, shadows, and distorted forms. They even thought about placing this in black and white, but they settled on more of a sepia tone. Erskine mentions Hitler's penchant for occult relics, which is another callback to Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Over the last 2 years, the Nazis have had teams of archaeologists running around the world looking for all kinds of religious artifacts.
Then he explains how the serum amplifies your body and your mind.
Serum amplifies everything that is inside, so good becomes great. Bad becomes worse.
Now, the prequel comic, First Vengeance, does show Schmidt's transformation, but we've already seen variations of the serum create similar mutations in the MCU. Banner struggled to contain his anger, so his version of the serum turned him into the Hulk. Emil Blonsky manifested weird CGI abs, and the serum unleashed John Walker's inner rage that he had kept bottled up.
How do you want the rest of this conversation to go, Sam? Huh? Should I put down a shield? Make it fair? They weren't even super soldier.
Now, I do want to point out that this scene illustrates one of the many reasons Chris Evans was perfect casting for this role. Erskine says,
"But a weak man knows the value of strength and knows compassion."
And Chris Evans may be a beefcake in this movie, but here's a photo of him as a skinny theater nerd playing Harold Hill in his high school production of The Music Man. Like Steve Rogers, Evans is also very humble. He turned down the role 3 times because he wasn't sure he wanted that level of fame. And then there is the brief scene where Schmidt is having his portrait done, and shout out to Canadian Lad for pointing out that just for a second we can see the Red Skull when the lights first come on. And my favorite here is this painter. Look how he doesn't move an inch, like he is terrified.
Yeah, I bet he thought he was coming to paint a normal guy, and then he was like, ah, geez, I gotta get more red paint.
Yeah, and he's already taken like half the money for the gig, so he's just gotta finish it. Anyways, then we get to the big day, Steve's experiment. The old woman running the lab front is actually taken from Captain America Comics issue 1, but in that book, the old woman was actually Agent X-13 in disguise. So this hidden underground base also foreshadows how, decades later, Peggy, Phillips, and Howard will form a different underground base to headquarter S.H.I.E.L.D. at Camp Lehigh. So Steve's capsule was modeled after an Egyptian sarcophagus, which has a few meanings. The Red Skull believes that he and Rogers are closer to gods than men, and the ancient Egyptians embalmed their pharaohs and buried them in these sarcophagi until their resurrection as gods. And indeed, both Steve and the Red Skull lived decades longer than their lifespans, like they are also gods. And by the way, this chamber was a practical prop that actually moved. Now the whole scene, to me, feels like an homage to the 1931 film Frankenstein, which showed the monster being reanimated on a table when he's struck by electricity. Except in this case, it's the Vita radiation that transforms Steve. This is because the 1931 film was set at the end of the Industrial Age, and this film is set at the beginning of the Nuclear Age. Frankenstein is ultimately a morality tale about the dangers of using science to usurp Mother Nature, which is exactly what Erskine and Stark are doing here. There's also a neat parallel with this scene in the film Avengers Age of Ultron, where Ultron is also portrayed as kind of Tony Stark's Frankenstein's monster. And remember, the Vision is another creation in a sarcophagus that is brought to life with the lightning of a god, just like Frankenstein. Remember, Steve said,
I really miss the days when the weirdest thing science ever created was me.
So what we're seeing here is this scene sets a precedent that's going to be followed throughout many MCU films over the decades. Now, another small detail here, notice that Howard Stark not only built this device, but he also made sure to use Stark branded products for the dials. And there's also a panel here showing the diagram of a brain. And during the experiment, this part of it glows. Now this is the cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls motor functions. So it makes total sense that to augment a person's muscles and strength, you would also have to increase their ability to actually move their new enhanced muscles. Now in the audio commentary, Joe Johnston said that they didn't want this to feel like a body horror sequence, but they still wanted it to feel painful, just more like a space launch, which is why Steve screams at first, but then says this.
I can do this!
But this moment also has ties to mythology. Oftentimes in myth, we have a hero who's like skinny Steve Rogers, who is an ordinary person or even weak by normal standards. And this hero always has to sacrifice something or a part of himself in order to gain new power, or as Joseph Campbell called it, the boon. For instance, Luke Skywalker loses a hand but becomes stronger in the Force. And then we get the big reveal. Now, Chris Evans actually did like 50 push-ups just before they got this shot, just to give himself just a little bit of extra bulk. And Haley Atwell was so overcome by his physique that this moment wasn't even scripted when she almost touches his chest. So they left it in because it's a fun little improv moment. Now, I do want to point out that there are some intentional parallels between the origins of Steve and Tony Stark. They were both mentored by an older man who had lost his wife and family. In fact, in the prequel comic, we find out that Erskine's family died in a concentration camp. Now, both of these old men see the good in the heroes, and they each die just as the heroes get their superpowers or their super suit. As they die, they ask the hero to fulfill their potential to the world.
Don't waste your lives.
And notice these shots are framed almost as mirror images of each other. Also, both origin films show the heroes slowly upgrading their gear, Tony's armor and Steve's shield, and the final models are silver before a Stark boy adds in a splash of color. And then we get the foot chase where, like Tony, Steve has his awkward first steps as a hero. Of course, Tony crashed his suit twice, and Steve is just a little clumsy. Now, first of all, though, I do want to point out that this shop on the street is selling just banjos and ukuleles, which were apparently really popular in the 1940s. Right, Bucky?
I like 40s music, so.
Agent Carter is actually an amazing shot, taking out the driver from what, like 50 yards away with just a pistol? Shout out to Canadian Lad here for this cool observation. When Steve goes to jump the fence, he has his arms up in the air because he expects to grab the top of the fence, but then he accidentally leaps over it completely. He runs across the rooftops of these cars, just like he does in the Battle of New York and the Avengers. He gets this Hydra agent on foot. Now, first of all, notice the War Bonds billboard behind him, foreshadowing his future career as a war bond salesman, and then he grabs the door of this cab to use as a shield. Again, notice the star in the center, foreshadowing his classic shield. A woman in the crowd takes a photo of him, which is in the newspaper later, and also we see that in the Smithsonian scene in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The Hydra agent gets into a submarine called the Fischer Dorsch, which translates to vicious cod, and it's based on actual German designs for a midget submarine called the Martyr, which is German for your mom. The Hydra sub uses jet propulsion instead of propellers to show how much more advanced Hydra's technology was at the time. Then the Hydra agent bites down on a cyanide pill hidden in his tooth. Now, the cyanide pill tooth is a famous part of spy lore that actually isn't true at all. It would take a lot more cyanide to kill you than you could possibly fit in a human tooth. But it is thought that this is inspired by how Heinrich Himmler killed himself with cyanide rather than face justice for the atrocities he committed.
Coward.
Now, one big problem I have always had with this movie is that technically the Red Skull kills more Nazis than Captain America, which makes the next scene so much fun. When the Führer sends his minions to reprimand Schmidt, he condescends to them about how they see science as magic.
You still aim to win this war through magic?
Science, but I understand your confusion. Great power has always baffled primitive men.
Now this is actually how the MCU has always explained magic. I mean, remember this conversation in Thor?
Your ancestors called it magic, and you call it science. Well, I come from a place where they're one and the same thing.
Get this, they are named Rotor, Yutter, and Schneider after the members of the German band Kraftwerk. In fact, Kraftwerk are credited as one of the early creators of techno. There's a cool moment here where he actually counts the number of Nazis before he calibrates his machine. And this is the scene where we actually see Hydra uniforms for the first time. And they're actually comic accurate. See, in the comics, Hydra henchmen wear green jumpsuits with a yellow H. And the Hydra suits in this movie have straps that also make an H, but, you know, they wear different shades of black so it doesn't look silly. And of course, their salute is straight from the comics. Oh, and let's show that Nazi murder one more time. Now, after the procedure, Steve gets his first taste of being a lab rat.
Think you got enough?
Now, there's actually a lot of setup just in this one line. See, we saw Steve's blood become a major plot point in the show Agent Carter. When Peggy finally dumped the last of his blood, it's a symbol that she was trying to get over him. But of course, in Captain America Civil War, we saw that Howard Stark not only had more of Steve's blood, but he was also able to replicate it. And this replication allowed Hydra to create the other super soldiers we see in that film, and it allowed the Russians to create the Red Guardian.
Wow.
Steve desperately wants to fight. Again, he wants to join a team. But just like when he was told he is 4F, he is told you are not enough. Instead, they send him out on tour to sell war bonds.
Yeah, what is a war bond anyways?
So in the old days, the government had to pay for the war by actually selling bonds to the public. So the war required public support. During Vietnam, the war was more unpopular and also not technically a war. So the government paid for the war just by printing more money, which led to devastating inflation. But during World War II, there were actually traveling shows and films like this to appeal to people's patriotism and raise money for the war.
$10,000 worth of bonds headed for Tojo. There they go.
Now, it's interesting to compare Steve's history with another super soldier, Isaiah Bradley. You see, Bradley was one of many black soldiers that the government used for super soldier experiments during the Cold War. In fact, Isaiah's procedure was a success, and he even fought the Winter Soldier in Korea in the 1950s.
We met in 51.
If by met you mean I whooped your ass.
But the government didn't want to reveal they had an African-American super soldier, so they locked Bradley up for 30 years. Whereas Steve Rogers is allowed to leave the lab because he has blonde hair and blue eyes. Ironically, he's a perfect Nazi poster boy. Now, for the tour, Steve wears a comic-accurate costume, like the one in the unfortunate 1990 film. Note the wingtips on his head and the swashbuckler boots. So this begins the fun MCU tradition of showing us cheap comic-accurate costumes that continued with Wanda, Vision, Quicksilver, Loki, and even Thor. And also here we have another similarity to Tony Stark. They're both superheroes who achieve fame and then were accompanied by backup dancers. The song they sing here is called The Star-Spangled Man, with music composed by Alan Menken.
Alan Menken? Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, and Newsies?
Yes, that Alan Menken.
I love Alan Menken.
And also, you know, David Zippel did the lyrics to this song.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so we heard this song in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The marching band plays it when John Walker was announced as the new Captain America. Because the government was really trying to promote Walker as the new Steve Rogers, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, small-town patriot. Even in the modern day, the government made the same mistake as Phillips when he wanted to pick Hodge.
He's big, he's fast, he obeys orders, he's a soldier.
So Steve does reluctantly enjoy his fame, but he's still being forced to do what he wanted to avoid. He's helping out on the home front. Except instead of collecting trash like one of the kids, he has to pretend to be a soldier. So in this shot, we actually see them walking on treadmills, which is funny because they used a lot of actual treadmills while filming this movie. This tank in the background is actually an American tank from the 1930s. This is an M5 tank that is painted in German colors, which makes sense because this is exactly the type of tank that Hollywood would have had access to when they filmed in 1943. Now the climax of the show is Steve reenacting the iconic Hitler punch from Captain America Comics issue 1. Now this actor, James Payton, played such a good Hitler that he reprised the role 3 years later in the movie Monuments Men. During the montage, we see the punch on Captain America Comics issue 1, but minus Bucky from the corner, who of course did not appear as a teen sidekick in this movie, so it wouldn't make sense if he was on the comic book cover. We also see many soldiers reading comics, which was a very common thing during the war. In fact, comic sales skyrocketed just because GIs devoured comic books. Think about it, they're thin, they're easy to fit in your bag, and they're easy to ship overseas from home. Superman and Captain America were very popular strips, but so were strips depicting real stories from soldiers like Guadalcanal Diary. Also on the tour, we see Steve signing an autograph for the actress Laura Haddock, who of course also played Peter Quill's mom Meredith Quill, and this gives rise to the theory that Steve Rogers is actually Peter Quill's grandfather. And I should note that one of these chorus dancers punched Steve's V-card, as confirmed by Bruce Banner.
Steve Rogers is not a virgin. He lost his virginity to a girl in 1943 on the USO tour.
The shield on the tour is the same one that Steve used in his first appearance in the comics. But at the time, Archie Comics actually had a character called the Shield with a similar looking weapon. Archie Comics threatened to sue, so Jack Kirby changed it to a round shield. And it's a good thing too, because the round shield allowed for Steve to throw it like a frisbee.
Bounce it off walls, to throw it around, to have it return to him.
And eventually, Archie Comics would abandon their shield characters so they could focus on creating books about the sex lives of minors. All of the dance sequences were shot in the same theater, so the filmmakers had to work to find different angles to make it seem like they were in new locations every time. And the finale is set in Radio City Music Hall, the largest proscenium stage in the world. Now, they actually only had about 8 dancers for this sequence, and then they used CGI to duplicate them. If you look closely, you can actually tell that some of these women are the same person. And of course, the stage picture at the end forms another early design for Steve's shield, as we get this slow progression towards Captain America in his full uniform. But believe it or not, this progression actually continued throughout the entire MCU until Avengers Endgame. But I'll talk about that in just a bit. So this is the most famous iteration of Captain America, the one the public was most famous with because he was in films and posters and trading cards. In fact, one of these posters was replicated on Phil Coulson's vintage Captain America trading cards that we saw in the Avengers.
Oh, you mean the card that Fury dipped into the gash in his friend's chest?
That's the one. So because Coulson was such a big fan of this iteration of Captain America, that explains why the new suit he designs for him in the Avengers was actually closer to the fictional Cap than the one he actually wore in World War II.
We made some modifications to the uniform. I had a little design input.
So we go from the bright colors of Radio City to the desaturated battlefield of Italy. Now note just how out of place Steve and the stage look here. They're very bright, deep, saturated colors, and everything else looks muted. Again, this is making him feel like an outsider, the person who never fit in.
Women aren't exactly lining up to dance with a guy they might step on.
Going back to Steve's primary goal, that he wants to belong to a team. Now originally, there was another scene inserted here. We went from the fireworks of the show to the artillery bursting over the battlefield. Bucky and the 107th were pinned down until the Nazis were killed by Hydra troops, who then took the Americans prisoner. But they cut it out because this undermined the reveal when Schmidt turns on the Nazis later on. And of course, I think the harsh cut works way better. So one of the hecklers in the crowd is that bully from boot camp, Hodge. I bring that up because after Steve rescues everybody, they make sure to cut to Hodge to show how impressed he is by Captain America. Now, after the show, Steve draws himself as a dancing monkey, and actually, we see this same drawing on his desk decades later in Civil War. Shout out to New Rockstars for catching that little detail. Now, on the opposite page, though, we also see his diary of his train trip through Italy. Now, all of this is referencing Steve's job in the comics, where his secret identity is a comic book illustrator who draws Captain America comics. Now, there's a really cool moment here when Steve sees the wounded coming in from the battlefield. Listen to the score.
They look like they've been through hell.
That is the same leitmotif that was repeated during the portal scene in Avengers Endgame. Now, the reason this appears is because oftentimes the score is reflecting how a character feels or what they're remembering at the time. So this score in First Avenger is about Steve feeling alone. He's being prevented from joining a team. But in Endgame, more instruments are added to this trumpet. So this is Steve knowing that from now on, he will never be alone again.
Dang, person.
Let me cook, little guy.
He's a cooking something up.
Steve is called into action when he hears that Bucky's unit was attacked.
Your audience contained what was left of the 107th. The rest were killed or captured.
The 107th?
And this sets up his primary motivation throughout his trilogy. In Winter Soldier and Civil War, he's always still trying to save Bucky.
I don't think he's the kind you save. He's the kind you stop.
I don't know if I can do that.
So then Steve mounts his rescue, and notice how Stark's civilian aircraft has his company logo on the wing. In this sequence, Steve wears a jacket over his uniform, and concept artist Ryan Meinerding specifically pulled this image from Steve's appearance in the comic book The Ultimates #1. So the Ultimate Universe was an alternate universe from the main Marvel comics, and it presented the hero's origins in modern day and portrayed them a little more realistically. Now, the MCU Avengers were based largely on the Ultimate storyline, with Nick Fury assembling the team. In fact, artist Brian Hitch drew Nick Fury to look like Sam Jackson years before he was even cast in the MCU. Not for nothing, the Ultimates also gave us great moments like Steve asking an alien if the A on his head stands for France, and also weird moments like the Hulk insisting that he is straight. The screenwriters of the movie, Marcus and McFeely, said that this rescue outfit was a deliberate choice to show Steve's slow transition into his final suit.
The decision to keep the colors perhaps slightly cooler than on stage is his, because he sees how much it's valued by other people.
So I want to take a minute to point out the incredible work the filmmakers did on the Hydra gear and vehicles. Their goal was to make the technology seem futuristic, but like it was made from materials that were available at the time. So the tanks, the bikes, and the train all have the same sleek look, with a similar aesthetic to the actual Hydra uniforms. But like that midget torpedo I mentioned earlier, many vehicles were actually taken from unused German designs. The single-person helicopter that Schmidt uses is based off the Triebflugeljäger fighter plane, and the Valkyrie at the end of the movie is based on the Horton H-18 wing bomber, a kind of precursor to the American stealth bomber. Now notice that, once he decides to go help Bucky, the rain stops, which was pretty lucky because actually Joe Johnston had rain machines ready on the day of filming, but then it actually rained. The rain stopping is also a way of showing that Steve now has moral clarity and he's free to choose his own path. Now, on the plane, he thinks Howard Stark is talking dirty when he says,
I thought we could stop off in Lucerne for a late-night fondue.
But look, you can't blame him. Howard Stark clearly said that as a euphemism. As we'll talk about later on, people in the 1940s had lots of indirect ways of talking about sex. Steve jumping out of this plane was also adapted from the opening panels of Ultimates issue 1, and of course, it's part of a pattern set by many heroes in the MCU. Now, I keep mentioning how Steve's first movie parallels Tony Stark's, but this sequence is also reminiscent of Thor breaking into the S.H.I.E.L.D. base to retrieve his hammer in his first film, except Thor begins his movie at the apex of his strength and then he has to be humbled, whereas Steve begins at his weakest and he gains strength throughout his movie. Steve breaks in by beating up some guys in the back of a truck, which seems like another nod to the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the first people he meets are the future Howling Commandos. So this team is taken from the comics Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. This was a book set during World War II, and it featured the first appearance of Nick Fury. Now, later on, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby decided to use Fury in the modern day, saying that he kept young by using something called an Infinity Serum. The memberships of the Commandos has also changed over the years, but one core member is Dum Dum Dugan, who is a former circus strongman before he was recruited by Fury. Just like in the comics, he wears a silly bowler hat, and during the battle he even yells his catchphrase, Wahoo! He is played by Neil McDonough, and you Arrowverse fans probably know him as Damien Dark. Then there is the member of the French Resistance Dernier, which means last in French, appropriate since his specialty is explosions. And there's also Marita, played by Kenneth Choi. Now famously, he also played this character's grandson, Peter Parker's principal in Homecoming. We even see a picture of his granddad on his desk. Montgomery Falsworth becomes the hero Union Jack in the comics. Now he was never technically a Howling Commando, but Union Jack was part of the World War II era super team called the Invaders, alongside Captain America, the Human Torch, Namor, and several others. Now, it's never been confirmed, but it's likely that Sonya Falsworth from Secret Invasion is related to him. And let's face it, Olivia Colman was by far the best part of that show, and we need to see her back in the MCU.
I'm very good at being your bestie.
I'm also devilishly good at being not your bestie. It's really just a matter of taste. Cake or death.
And there's also Gabe Jones, one of the first black characters in Marvel Comics. In fact, in his first appearance, the colorist still made him white because he assumed that Jack Kirby made a mistake with the art description. Now, Jones's grandson, Trip, was a supporting character on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where he also used some of his granddad's old Howling Commando gear. I should also note that the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. showed us that Peggy Carter took over leadership of the Howling Commandos, helping to mop up Hydra bases and even encountering an early version of the Red Room in Russia. So, when Steve finds Bucky, he's repeating his name, rank, and serial number.
Sergeant.
Now this is standard for all POWs, but it's also foreshadowing how he'll be entranced by a series of recited words.
Желание. Живой.
Stop.
During the battle, notice the Hydra weapons make the same charging sound as Tony's repulsor rays, making me think, once again, that Zola's designs were used by Howard Stark and then improved upon by Tony. Now, as Zola escapes, we see a schematic of the robot body that he has in the comics, and damn it, I still want to see the robot Zola in the movies. When we see the map of Hydra bases, one of them is located due north of Berlin and Piedmont. Now, this is where Werner von Braun's rocket program was headquartered. Von Braun was one of the scientists recruited under the actual Operation Paperclip and was one of the founding fathers of NASA. And he was also a character in Joe Johnston's film, October Sky. And then, on the bridge, the Red Skull finally reveals himself.
No matter what lies Aston told you see, I was his greatest success!
So, we got a lot to explain here. According to Joe Simon, the Red Skull's iconic look was inspired by a hot fudge sundae.
Then I saw the big cherry on top of it, and I said, that's it, the Red Skull. It was the cherry.
And in the years since, this look has made him stand apart from any other villain in Marvel Comics. It's the simplicity of design that makes it work. Like a skull typically represents death, but a red skull implies a kind of unnatural or demonic death. Now, Hugo Weaving did not actually want to return to this role because it was a one-note character and he found the makeup process grueling, although he did have some fun with the look on set.
To suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them.
But this prosthetic actually allowed for an incredible range of movement. The makeup was attached in 7 different pieces, which even allowed him the mobility to raise his eyebrows. And then they used CGI to augment the makeup, removing his nose and thinning out his lips. But still, Russ Marquand reprised the role in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Now, when Schmidt is first revealed, they do a neat trick where they cut away briefly, because the first shot is Hugo Weaving's actual face and he's grabbing a CGI mask. And then they cut to Steve and then back to Weaving, who is now in his skull makeup and pulling away a real rubber mask. After he escapes, Steve has to make a long jump. And again, listen to the score. That is the same leitmotif that we hear in Avengers Endgame when Steve first uses the hammer. And again, the score is expressing what Steve is feeling. In this case, it's about him summoning his courage. When they arrive back at camp, Bucky says one of the most important lines in the movie.
Let's hear it for Captain America!
Now think about it. If Bucky had not said that, then Steve might have just become an ordinary soldier. But the fact that people then embrace the name and the costume means that Steve now understands that this persona can be used as a symbol to inspire hope. Afterwards, Steve stands up the senator at the Medal of Honor ceremony, and of course, this is Stan Lee in the audience, but did you know that the guy next to him is Reb Brown, who played Captain America in the 2 TV movies in the 70s. And there's actually a deleted scene that follows this where Tommy Lee Jones gives Rogers the medal as a reward for embarrassing the senator.
You just embarrassed the United States senator in front of a room full of reporters and 10 members of parliament. He deserves a medal just for that.
And get this, Jeff Goldblum was originally offered the part of Senator Brandt, but he turned it down. And good thing, or we might not have ever gotten this.
You're officially pardoned from life.
At the bar later, Haley Atwell enters wearing a red dress that costumer Anna B. Shepard originally designed for Melanie Laurent in Inglourious Basterds, but she ended up never wearing it in that film. In the underground lab, Howard is studying a piece of the Tesseract energy that's taken from the clip of the Hydra weapon that Steve captured. Now, Howard tries to understand the Tesseract for years. It's why it appears in his journal in Iron Man 2. And of course, years later, we see a very similar shot where Tony will also look through a protective shield while assembling the Infinity Stones into the Nano Gauntlet. talent. So once again, it was up to Tony to finish the work his father started. We also see these techs making all sorts of James Bond addition to Steve's bike that we're going to see later on. It has grappling hooks to use as tripwires, a flamethrower burst from the engine, and it launches missiles from the front. Howard plays the role of Steve's Q, making him gadgets and arming him up. Notice there's chainmail on the table, a nod to the scales of Steve's costume in the comics, which were, by the way, finally adapted for his last suit in Avengers Endgame, completing that arc of Captain America's suits becoming more comic accurate throughout this franchise. And then Steve gets his shield, which is just like when Farmer Hoggett met Babe.
And for a fleeting moment, something passed between them, a faint sense of some common destiny.
In the comics, Steve's shield is made from a mixture of an unknown alloy, vibranium, and adamantium, but since Fox then owned the film rights to the X-Men, they just left it at plain old vibranium. Also in the comics, he was given the shield by FDR himself. Now, in the MCU, we're not clear where Howard got the medal, but in the comics, Steve met T'Challa, the Black Panther who was king of Wakanda during World War II. So, I would like to think that Howard Stark, like some Victorian explorer, actually ventured into some ancient Wakanda temple and discovered this medal. Or maybe they took it from an artifact, like the vibranium axe that Killmonger takes in Black Panther. And then Peggy shows up jealous that Steve just kissed Game of Thrones Natalie Dormer, and she fires a gun at the shield. Now, I do think that she was around for tests on this metal before, so she knew exactly what vibranium was capable of. For one thing, I don't think she would actually try to kill Steve. But for another, notice that the bullets don't ricochet, they fall flat. This is because the vibranium absorbs all the kinetic energy from the bullets. Peggy would have only fired the gun if she knew the bullets wouldn't bounce off and hurt someone. Captain America's shield is one of the most iconic weapons in comics.
Obviously, aside from just being a symbolic weapon, that he's there to metaphorically shield us from harm and the bad guys.
And in this film, they actually used a wide variety of shields for different reasons.
They have so many different shields in this film. We have the heavy shields, we have rubber shield, had a couple shields that are magnetic, and every now and then we'll have to do a shot where I have to throw it, and those just CGI it.
Now, the CGI of the shield is great, but it only works because Chris Evans does such a good job selling the illusion.
The toughest thing about the shield was making it believable that this guy could throw this thing, have it bounce off something and take some guy out and have it come back to him.
He could have looked silly in an American flag outfit, pretending to throw a metal frisbee, but Evans sells it by being so damn forthright in every scene. Now at first, we see Steve using a pistol to fight Hydra agents and only using his shield for defense. But as the movie goes on, he throws the shield more and more, similar to how the shield evolved in the comics. It began as a simple shield until Jack Kirby grew more innovative with its range as a weapon. Steve uses his artist skill to design his own uniform, which again is taken from the comic book The Adventures of Captain America, which shows Steve drawing several drafts of the costume, including the one that Reb Brown wore in the 1970s TV movie. Now I've been thinking about it, and I think Steve decided to run around the battlefield as Captain America for two reasons. One, like I said earlier, it allowed for him to be a symbol for others. But more importantly, dressing up as the American flag meant that he could draw fire away from his squad mates, and it turned him into a living target that would help save their lives. Now, the suit itself is incredible. Costumer Anna Shepard said it best.
Finding a way of constructing it so it works on the actor, is comfortable, and looks good on the screen is difficult.
They tried to make the suit as functional as possible, like a Kelvar weave with nylon straps. Every part of the suit is actually there to serve a specific function. Unlike some superhero suits, this one never restricts his motion. His helmet even has a chin strap because it's modeled after the helmet of a paratrooper. And yet, the suit still finds ways to be true to the comics. For instance, they still painted the little wings on the side of his helmet when they could have ditched them altogether. And then we have the movie's final montage where Steve finally gets what he always wanted, to be part of a team. Now, I have read online rumors that both Wolverine and Magneto were in early drafts of the screenplay, which would kind of make sense. I mean, Captain America could have liberated Eric Lensher's concentration camp, and Logan did fight in World War II. I mean, we see him at Normandy in the opening montage of X-Men Origins Wolverine. And by the way, there's also a great comic book called Origins, where Logan meets with Captain America to learn about his lost past as a World War II soldier back when they fought together. And of course, we saw the two of them fight a mission against the Axis powers in a flashback episode of X-Men the Animated Series. But I cannot actually find out where this rumor came from. I think if anything, Feige might have said, oh, well, we would have loved it if Hugh could have been in this movie, and then the internet just ran with it. But Hugh Jackman is back playing the part till he's 90, so never say never to a Captain America Wolverine 1940s crossover. Now, in this montage, we see that Steve has Peggy's picture inside of his compass. Now, we see him come back to this compass over and over throughout the next films. He opens it to remember her when he visits the Smithsonian, and then again when he's on the Benatar going off to confront Thanos. Now, normally, Normally, you would place a loved one's face in a locket, like Agatha did for her son, Nicholas Scratch, but there's a symbolic meaning here. Peggy is actually Cap's true north and his own moral compass. He even credits her with his decision to join S.H.I.E.L.D.
Knowing that you helped found S.H.I.E.L.D. is half the reason I stay.
So whenever he's in a difficult situation, he always thinks, what would Peggy do? And then we go to the worst day of Steve's life, the attack on the Hydra train. Now the costume that Bucky wears in this scene is actually very similar to the suit he wore in the comics, and there's a specific reason for that. When Cap was unthawed in Avengers issue 4, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee thought that it would be poignant if Steve had suffered the loss of his best friend at the end of the war. Like he says in the comic, he's gone, and with all my power, all my strength, I couldn't save him. And I have to think that this was Kirby imprinting some of his own battle experiences from World War II into this story, like he detailed in the documentary Kirby at War.
Out of 1,000 men, only me and 4 other guys came out.
Bucky's death was actually a big deal at the time. Like, teen sidekicks in comics abided by that central rule of storytelling: kids don't die! And for years, the axiom in comics was the only people who stay dead are Uncle Ben and Bucky. Now, the channel-heavy spoilers pointed out that in What If Episode 1, it's revealed that the name of this mountain that they jump from is called Where Eagles Dare, named after the 1968 film where Clint Eastwood climbs a mountain to save a captured general during World War II. And that movie was also the inspiration for the Clone Wars episode Citadel Rescue.
Wow, really?
I don't know, maybe. So notice that Marita is using a stolen Hydra communications console, which is how they're able to track enemy movements and their train schedules. And just before they jump, Bucky says,
"Remember when I made you ride the Cyclone at Coney Island?"
And this is the same roller coaster that Spider-Man perches on in the final fight of Spider-Man Homecoming. The fight on the train is somewhat repeated in the What If episode Zombies, with some frames being replicated shot for shot. And in this fight, Bucky briefly uses the shield like he does in every Captain America movie. Now, in the comics, Bucky did become Captain America after Steve Rogers was mostly dead. Then, when Steve came back, he offered the shield to Sam Wilson, so many people thought the MCU was actually setting up Bucky, and not Sam, to be the new Captain America. Just like in the comics, Steve loses Bucky when he falls from a high place, in a scene that seems like it borrows some shot composition from the opening scene of Cliffhanger. Now, years later, there are going to be 10 words that activate the Winter Soldier's brainwashing, and remember, the final word is... probably because that word calls back to this original trauma.
Hey, yeah, how did he survive falling down that far?
Well, in the audio commentary, Joe Johnston hints that it was because of the experiments that Zola was already doing on him when he was captured. Afterwards, Zola is jailed, and actually, we did see Toby Jones get to play this role again in the show Agent Carter. He's in prison when he meets the Captain America villain, Dr. Faustus, and then recruits him into his brand new Hydra.
But given time and a bit of quiet, new visions will arise.
So, bear in mind that all through this movie, Zola is still a Hydra loyalist, but he disagrees with Schmidt's methods. We see him cast Schmidt these disapproving looks, and the Skull's appearance makes him uncomfortable. I think that Zola thought that Schmidt's method of bombing major cities wholesale was just too messy, and instead, he felt that Hydra should be more precise, more scientific, which is why he secretly spent his years at S.H.I.E.L.D. developing his algorithm instead of creating, renewable energy with Howard Stark. The bar where Steve talks to Peggy is actually the same bar from earlier in the film, but it's been bombed out from the Blitz. So this is an external representation of how Steve feels. The good times with his friends are all gone and his world is metaphorically destroyed. And this is also how he felt after he lost Bucky again following Thanos' snap. And just as Peggy comes to comfort him here, he looks at her photo for comfort in Avengers Endgame. This all leads into Steve's final assault on the base. The high-speed motorcycle chase in the forest could have been inspired by the speeder chase in Return of the Jedi, which Joe Johnston worked on as a visual effects designer. Now, notice in this fight that his shield is able to fully absorb and distribute the energy from the Tesseract, which makes sense because vibranium does come from space. We don't know what the hell it was used for in space. Now, there is an awesome moment in this fight where Steve fully embraces what his shield can do. He throws it against this tank, it ricochets and hits this guy, and then it flies up into the air while Steve takes out a Hydra agent, and then while he's looking up, he catches the shield. Steve's bike also has a self-destruct button that blows up this door, beginning his tradition of sacrificing awesome bikes in the middle of a fight. After he's captured, he's brought before the Red Skull. And I want to point out that the Skull is actually jealous of Steve Rogers. Erskine didn't think Schmidt was right for the formula, but he chose Steve. So when the Skull asks what makes Steve so special, his response,
"Nothing. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn,"
enrages Schmidt. Remember, in the comics, the Red Skull believes in this pure Aryan ideal. So he is jealous that the serum made Steve into a true Superman while it turned him into a monster.
He resented my genius and tried to deny me what was rightfully mine.
but he gave you everything.
And then Steve repeats the catchphrase he'll repeat in multiple movies after this.
I can do this all day. Yeah, I know.
As the Howling Commandos come to the rescue. Once Steve is on board the Valkyrie, he sees that the bombs have all been clearly labeled with the names of cities, similar to how our 2 atomic bombs in the war were nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man, which also may have been named after Winston Churchill. Once again, these manned-flying bombs are inspired by real German designs for the Feisler Fi-103R, aka the Reichenberg. These were real suicide bombs that Germany designed but never built. So in the ship, he fights a Hydra agent with a pocket knife, which, you know, Howard Stark implied would never happen.
Hydra's not going to attack you with a pocket knife.
So the bridge of this bomber was actually built on a gimbal, so the set could actually move and rock back and forth. But according to Joe Johnston, they rarely made it move for their shots, relying on camera tricks to make it seem like the plane was yawing and yewing out of control. And for these shots where they're on the ceiling, they actually redressed the floor to look like the ceiling and then filmed it from above. Now Red Skull has a couple of interesting lines here. He says,
"You could have the power of the gods!"
And of course, in Avengers Endgame, Steve does wield the power of the gods. And the Skull also says,
"Think you fight a battle of nations? I have seen the future, Captain. No flags!"
And this is actually what Hydra tries to build in the Winter Soldier, a borderless nation that they rule and control. They wanted to use Project Insight to attack these targets indiscriminately around the world, regardless of their nation. Now, even though Steve eventually proves that he is worthy to use the power of the gods, the Red Skull is not worthy, and the cube teleports him to Vormir to guard the Soul Stone.
Yeah, now why'd that happen?
Well, it's never fully explained, but I have my theories. In an Avengers Age of Ultron deleted scene, the Norns explain that the stones are connected, and on Vormir, the Red Skull explains that the Soul Stone has a type of consciousness. So I've always thought that the Soul Stone, which is connected to the Space Stone, called Schmidt to Vormir as penance for his crimes. So this movie, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, ends with the Nazi being defeated by divine power, instead of the hero punching his way through the situation. There's even a sky beam in both films. Afterwards, the cube dissolves through the floor like the Xenomorph's blood falling through the ship hull in Alien. Now, I have to praise this movie for being very different from most other films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Most of these movies end with a giant action set piece where the hero beats up the villain in a straight up fight. But this movie chose to give us this sad, almost Empire Strikes Back level downer. Steve gets on the radio to Peggy where they plan out their dance.
You're gonna need a rain check on that dance.
All right. A week next Saturday at the Stork Club.
You got it.
Now, I will say that this was the 1940s, so dance was clearly a euphemism. Like when Rhett Butler said this.
No, I don't think I will kiss you. Although you need kissing badly.
He was not talking about kissing Scarlett at all. Steve first mentioned that he never danced with a woman earlier in the film. And later, Peggy gives him the dance with me eyes at the bar. And of course, all of this leads up to Steve and Peggy finally getting their dance together and living happily ever after. But back to this scene. It's also similar to the beginning of a movie called A Matter of Life and Death, about a pilot who falls in love with the woman he speaks to over the radio as his plane goes down. And like Steve, this pilot survives his crash. But pay close attention to the score here. That is the same leitmotif we hear when Steve sees Peggy in the 1970s in Avengers Endgame. Again, the score is expressing how Steve feels. At that moment, he was looking at Peggy and remembering the heartache that he felt when he realized he would never see her again. Now, as for whether Steve had to go down with the ship, that's been up for debate, like we saw in this deleted scene from Endgame.
And you couldn't have jumped out of the plane before you crashed it?
Afterwards, Peggy longingly looks at the photo of Steve that will be on her desk in Avengers Endgame, so it's sweet to know that these two people, separated by decades, longed for each other by looking at old photographs. That is, unless you believe the theory that Steve was actually Peggy's husband in the MCU and this is him at the funeral, but hey, let's save that for another video. Afterwards, we see that Captain America continues to inspire children, making their own shields from trash can lids, just like that skinny kid from Brooklyn did earlier in this movie. Now, the show Agent Carter actually showed Peggy going through the grieving process and showed us the early days of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s funding. And I've always thought that that name, S.H.I.E.L.D., was a tribute to Captain America. But then we get this final scene where Steve wakes up in his SSR shirt listening to a baseball game from May 25th, 1941, when the Brooklyn Dodgers defeated the Phillies 8-4. Now, S.H.I.E.L.D. really underestimated how big of a sports nerd Steve was.
The game. It's from May 1941. I know because I was there.
But to be fair, this was a very memorable game, with Pete Riesler winning it with the grand slam in the 6th. But you know, the super soldier serum also enhances your senses, so Steve probably also noticed that the room didn't smell like it was next to an open window. The point is, this was a pretty lame attempt to fool Steve. Now, it's rumored that Scarlett Johansson's character, the Black Widow, was going to appear in this movie. If so, Natasha was probably going to be the nurse that wakes Steve up at the end of the film. Then Steve runs through the streets of New York, a sequence meant to mirror the earlier scene when he first got his powers. In both scenes, Steve is taking his first steps after being reborn. First as a super soldier with a new body, and then after being transported into a new world. Now, they actually filmed this scene in Times Square, which, by the way, they would never do now because Marvel has this strict secrecy edict. This scene is adapted partially from Ultimates issue 3 when Nick Fury recruits Steve onto his new team. Now, originally, this sequence was much longer, with Fury explaining how Steve is alive and how the war went.
My docs say it was suspended animation.
What about the war? Did we win?
So this is where I want to offer a small complaint about this film. I really hate that it opens with finding Steve in the Arctic. I think this ending would have been so much more effective if this was a complete surprise. Like, for non-comic book fans, it would have been jarring to see this guy from the 40s suddenly in modern-day New York.
Or maybe they felt like it wouldn't make any sense if they didn't show them finding him in the ice.
I guess, but I still think they wasted a great twist ending by over-explaining it. And the final words of the film belong to Steve.
I had a date.
And this is the great tragic ending. Even after he put it all on the line, Steve is denied the thing that he wanted all along. He wanted to belong. He didn't want to be alone, but now he is alone. He is a man out of time. And throughout the rest of his arc in the MCU, he is going to be searching for his place in this new world. He is going to be searching for a team. So guys, that's our breakdown of Captain America: First Avenger. Do you know any details that I missed? I'm sure you do. Let me know in the comments below on our free to join Discord or on Twitter, Blue Sky, or Threads. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.